She scrubbed pots in the back of Seoul's most expensive restaurant, invisible to every diamond-draped guest, until the head chef pulled her forward to fix a burst pipe flooding the private dining room, and the man standing in the wreckage in a tailored black suit was the CEO whose face was on every magazine in the city, and whose fiancée was seated 3 feet away. He looked at Mary once, soaked the elbows in dishwater, and something in his chest went completely, dangerously still. Welcome to Afrokorea Seoul Stories. Please like, share, and subscribe. The kitchen at Seoul House smelled of scorched garlic and bleach at 11 at night, and Mary's arms ached to the bone. She had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon, elbow deep in a sink that never emptied, when Sheffo burst through the swinging doors, shouted her name like the building was on fire. It nearly was. A burst pipe behind the private dining room had sent water sheeting across imported marble, soaking the hem of a 200-guest engagement dinner in seconds. Mary was the only one who knew where the shut-off valve hid, buried behind a service panel no manager had bothered to label in 3 years. She ran. Water sprayed her uniform to the skin as she wrenched the valve closed, and when she straightened, gasping, a man was standing over her in a suit that cost more than her yearly rent, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable, dark as river stone. "You fixed it," he said, like he didn't quite believe it. "It's my job," Mary answered, wiping her hands on an already ruined apron, refusing to be embarrassed in front of him. Behind him, a woman in ivory silk watched with an expression sharp enough to cut glass. "Min-ho," the woman called, "come away from there before you're soaked too." He didn't move. Not immediately. He looked at Mary one more second longer than he should have, and something in his chest, some door that had been bolted shut for years, creaked open without his permission. Kang Min-ho was 34 years old, CEO of Kang Holdings, and engaged to CO Ji-un, daughter of one of the 5 most powerful families in Korea. He had never in his adult life looked twice at a woman who wasn't handed to him by a boardroom or a matchmaker. He looked twice now. The next day, Mary reported for her shift expecting nothing but another 12 hours of steam and grease. Instead, Sheffo met her at the door, flustered, holding an envelope with the Kang Holdings crest embossed in gold. "He wants to thank the staff," Sheffo said, though his eyes said he didn't believe that either. Inside was a bonus that equaled 2 months of Mary's wages, and a single line typed and signed, asterisk for the valve, and for not being afraid, asterisk. Mary read it 3 times in the alley behind the restaurant before she made herself stop. She was not a woman who let herself hope for things. Hope had cost her too much already. A father she'd buried in Legos, a visa that had nearly not come through, 3 years of nights just like this one. Hands raw, back bent, dreams folded small enough to fit in a coat pocket. She put the envelope in her bag and went back to the sink. A few days later, Kang Min-ho came back to Seoul House. Alone this time. No fiancé, no entourage. Just 2 quiet men who waited by the door while he sat at the bar and ordered tea. He did not drink. He asked Chef O casually which nights Mary worked. Chef O, who was no fool, answered honestly and then said nothing more, because a man like Kang Min-ho did not need to explain himself to anyone, and a chef who valued his restaurant's 4 Michelin stars did not ask questions of the family that half-owned the building. Mary didn't know he'd come. She found out 3 days later, when a smaller envelope arrived. Cash this time. No card, no explanation. Tucked under the mat where she left her shoes by the back entrance, in the exact spot only a member of staff could have known. She marched into Sheffo's office that afternoon and set it on his desk. "I don't want his money," she said. "It's not for me," Sheffo said carefully. "Then who?" She stopped. She already knew. That evening, when her shift ended near midnight, a black sedan idled outside the alley, engine humming low in the dark. The window rolled down. Kang Min-ho sat in the back seat, tie loosened, looking like a man who had spent all day pretending not to think about something. "You didn't take the second one," he said. "I don't take money from strangers," Mary said, arms crossed against the cold. "I'm not a stranger. I'm the man whose engagement dinner you saved. You're the man whose fiancée looked at me like I was something the water dragged in." Something flickered across his face. Not quite shame, but close to it. "She's not wrong to be careful," he said. "People want things from men like me. I don't want anything from you," Mary said, and turned to walk away into the freezing dark, coat pulled tight, chin lifted like armor. He didn't call after her, but the car didn't move for a long time after she disappeared around the corner. By the end of the week, Mary noticed small things she couldn't explain. A new heater installed in the kitchen's freezing back room. A donation, Sheffo said, avoiding her eyes. A raise for every dishwasher on staff. Backdated. A security light fixed over the alley door that had been broken for a year. None of it had her name on it. All of it had his fingerprints. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself a great many things that week that turned out not to be true. The following Tuesday, Kong Holdings held a private function at Seoul House, a smaller affair, board members only, the kind of dinner where fortunes were quietly redirected over wine older than most of the guests. Mary was pulled from the kitchen to help serve when two waitresses called in sick, her uniform ill-fitting, her hands trembling only slightly as she carried the first tray into a room full of men who could end careers with a raised eyebrow. She did not expect Kong Min-ho to be seated at the head of the table. She did not expect him to look up the moment she entered, as if some part of him had already known she would. She served without meeting his eyes. She was steady, professional, invisible, the way she'd trained herself to be for 3 years in this country that did not always make room for a woman, who looked like her, who spoke with an accent that made people's eyebrows rise before their manners caught up. But when she leaned to fill his glass, he said, quiet enough that only she could hear, "Mary." Her hand stilled on the bottle. "You know my name." "I know a great many things," he said, and there was something almost helpless in the way he said it, like confession he hadn't intended to make. "I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the water hit the floor." "Sir," she said low, urgent, aware of eyes that might be watching, "your fiancé is not here tonight," he said. And then, softer, "Finish your shift. Meet me by the garden door after. 5 minutes. That's all I ask." She should have said no. She told herself it 100 times over the next 2 hours as she cleared plates and refilled glasses and pretended her heart wasn't hammering every time his eyes found hers across the room. At midnight, she found herself standing by the garden door anyway. He was waiting in the dark beneath a paper lantern, hands in his pockets, looking younger somehow than he had at the head of that table, like the suit and the title were armor he'd finally set down. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted before she could speak. "I have never in my life done this. I am engaged. I have a merger closing in 6 weeks that depends on that engagement. And I cannot stop finding reasons to be in the same room as a woman who scrubs pots for a living and looked at me like I was nothing special at all." "You are nothing special," Mary said, though her voice shook on it. "You're just a man. A rich one. That's all." "Then why?" he said, stepping closer, close enough that she could smell cedar and rain on his coat. "Are you still standing here?" She didn't have an answer. She turned and left before she had to find one. And he let her go, watching her disappear into the dark with his jaw tight and his chest aching in a way he did not have a name for. The next morning, Seo Ji-un called an unscheduled visit to Kong Holdings Tower, her heels sharp against marble, her smile sharper still. "There's a rumor," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk like she owned it, "that you've taken an interest in kitchen staff." Min-ho did not look up from his tablet. "Rumors are rumors. I'd hate for one to become a scandal 6 weeks before our wedding," she said. "My father would hate it more. And you know what my father does to men who embarrass this family." "Are you threatening me, Ji-un?" "I'm reminding you," she said, standing, smoothing her skirt, "of what you agreed to. Love was never part of this contract. Min-ho, don't start pretending you wanted to be." She left. He sat alone in his glass office 30 floors above the city, staring at nothing, and for the first time in years, felt the walls of his own life closing around him like a cage he'd built himself. That evening, unable to help himself, he went back to Seoul House. He sat at the bar. He watched the kitchen doors. And when Mary emerged at the end of her shift, exhausted, hair escaping its knot, he was there before she reached the alley. "You shouldn't keep doing this," she said, though she didn't walk away. "I know," he said, "your fiancé." "I know," he said again, and the words cracked something open between them, an honesty neither of them had planned for. "I don't know how to stop." Then you need to try harder, Mary said, but her voice had gone soft, and when he reached for her hand, she let him hold it for 3 full seconds before she pulled away. "Good night, Kong Minho," she whispered, and walked into the dark alone, leaving him standing there with his heart doing something it had never done before, breaking quietly for a woman he had no right to want. A few days later, disaster struck in the shape of a young executive named Park Deun, junior partner at a rival firm, who had taken to lingering at Seoul House far too often for a man who claimed to hate the food. He cornered Mary by the delivery entrance one evening, all easy smiles and wandering eyes, and made it clear exactly what kind of attention he intended. "A woman like you shouldn't be wasting herself washing dishes," he said, stepping too close, his hand grazing her arm. "Don't touch me," Mary said, stepping back into the wall, her voice steady though her pulse wasn't. She didn't see the car pull up. She didn't see Kong Minho step out of it, coat still on from a meeting he'd left unfinished, until his hand closed over Deun's wrist like a vice. She said, "Don't touch her," Minho said, voice low and lethal in a way none of his board members had ever heard. Deun's face went pale. "Kong Minho, I didn't realize." "Leave," Minho said. "And if I hear you come near this restaurant again, I will make certain your firm never wins a contract in this country again." Deun left without another word. Mary stood frozen against the wall, breath unsteady, watching the man who had just offended her like she was something precious, something worth the risk of a scandal. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "Yes," Minho said, turning to her, his eyes dark with something fierce and unfamiliar even to himself. "I did." She should have thanked him and walked away. Instead, she found herself asking quietly, "Why do you keep coming back here, Minho?" "Because," he said, closing the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and she didn't. "I have spent my entire life being told what to want, who to marry, what to build. And the first time I have ever wanted something for myself, something no one arranged, no one approved, it's you." The lantern light caught the tears she refused to let fall. "This can only end badly," she whispered. "Maybe," he said, "but tell me to stop, and I will." She didn't tell him to stop. By the following week, their meetings had become a quiet, dangerous ritual. A few stolen minutes after a shift, a walk to the quieter streets near the Han River, where no camera dared follow a man like him. Conversations that started careful and ended raw. Two people slowly peeling back the armor they'd worn their whole lives. He learned that her father had been a tailor in Lagos who died the year before she left, that she'd come to Korea on a scholarship that fell through, that she stayed anyway because going home meant admitting she'd failed. She learned that his mother had died when he was 9, that his father had built an empire out of grief and control, that Minho had spent his whole life being groomed into a man who married strategy instead of love. "I used to think that was enough," he confessed one night, sitting on a bench overlooking the black water, city lights trembling on its surface. Marrying strategy, building an empire. "I never thought I'd want anything else." "And now?" Mary asked. He looked at her like the answer was obvious, like it had been obvious for weeks. "Now, I think I've been starving my whole life, and didn't know it until I met you." She reached for his hand this time. He held it like it was the only solid thing in a world that had started, quietly, to come apart. The following morning, Co. Jiun's father summoned Minho to his private office, a room of dark wood and darker portraits. 3 generations of family that did not tolerate embarrassment. "I've had you followed," the old man said without preamble. "A dishwasher, Minho. An African dishwasher, no less. Do you understand what you're risking? This merger secures both our families for the next generation. Break this engagement, and I will ruin more than your reputation. I will ruin your father's legacy." Minho's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, not because he agreed, because he was, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely afraid, not of the old man's threats, but of what it might cost a woman he had no right to love if he chose wrong. That night, he did not go to Seoul House. He sat alone in his penthouse, city lights bleeding gold through floor-to-ceiling windows, and drank 2 fingers of whiskey he never finished, staring at nothing, caught between the life he'd been built for and the one small, impossible thing he'd found that felt like it might actually be his. Mary noticed his absence like a held breath. 2 days, 3. She told herself it was better this way, that a man like her belonged to a world she'd never survive, that hope was a luxury she'd learned, painfully, not to afford. On the fourth night, she was locking up the alley door alone when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find him standing there, tie gone, hair disheveled, looking like a man who had been fighting something for days and lost. "I'm sorry," he said. "I needed to think." "About your fiancée," Mary said, not a question. "About everything," he said. "About what I owe my father's legacy. About a merger that will collapse 6,000 jobs if I walk away from it. About a woman. I cannot stop thinking about who deserves a man who isn't drowning in obligations that were never hers to carry." "Then maybe," Mary said, voice breaking despite herself, "you should let me go, Minho, before this destroys us both." He crossed the alley in 3 steps and took her face in his hands, gentle despite the desperation underneath it. "I have tried," he said. "I have tried every night this week to convince myself to let you go. I can't. I don't know how anymore. Minho, tell me you don't feel it too," he said, thumb brushing her cheekbone, "and I will walk away tonight and never come back." She could have lied. She wanted to, for both their sakes. Instead, she stood on her toes and pressed her forehead to his, breast shaking, and whispered the truth that terrified her more than anything else in her life so far. "I feel it too." He kissed her then, careful at first, like she was something that might shatter, and then not careful at all, years of restraint breaking loose in a single desperate motion, her hands fisting in his coat, his arms pulling her flush against him like he was afraid the night might take her from him if he let go. When they broke apart, both breathless, the city humming distant and indifferent around them, he pressed his lips to her forehead and said the words that would set everything in motion. "I'm ending it with Jian. Minho, the merger, will survive," he said, though neither of them fully believed it yet. "Or it won't. But I will not marry a woman I don't love while the one I do washes dishes 3 blocks from my office and pretend she doesn't matter to me. You matter, Mary, more than the company, more than my father's name." She kissed him again, slower this time, and for one suspended moment in a cold alley behind a restaurant that would never know what it had witnessed. Neither of them thought about the storm that was coming. They should have. Because 3 floors above a boardroom that would soon shake with the news, someone had already taken a photograph. Kong Minho, CEO of Kong Holdings, kissing a kitchen worker in an alley at midnight. And by morning, that photograph would be sitting on CO Ji-Yun's father's desk, and the war neither of them had asked would finally begin. By 7 the next morning, the photograph was everywhere. It landed first on CO Ji-Yun's father's desk, delivered by a private courier with no return address. And by the time Minho's assistant burst into his office without knocking, it already reached 3 financial news outlets and half the Kong Holdings board. "It's everywhere," his assistant said, breathless, sliding a tablet across the desk. "Someone leaked it overnight. The merger committee is asking for an emergency call in an hour." Minho stared at the image, himself tied loose and hands cradling a woman's face in an alley lit by nothing but a phone's flash, and felt the floor his careful, controlled life tilt sideways. "Get Ji-Yun's office on the phone," he said, voice flat with particular calm of a man holding a great deal together by sheer will. "And find out who took this photograph." His father called before Ji-Yun's office did, voice thunderous even through the phone. 40 years, his father said. 40 years I built this company on discipline, on control, on never giving the market a single reason to doubt us. And you hand them a scandal over a girl who washes dishes. "Her name is Mary," Minho said quietly. "I don't care what her name is," his father snapped. "Fix this. End it. Marry Ji-Yun as planned. Apologize publicly, and pray the board doesn't force you out before the ink dries on the merger." Minho hung up without answering. Across the city, Mary's morning began differently, with Shefo waiting outside her apartment building, face gray, holding a newspaper with her own blurred silhouette on the front page beside a headline that called her cruelly the CO's alley girl. "You need to disappear for a while," Shefo said, not unkindly. "Reporters were at the restaurant an hour ago. I told them nothing, but they'll find you, Mary. They always do." Mary's hand shook as she took the paper, her own life reduced to a scandal she hadn't chosen, a story other people were already writing for her. "This isn't fair," she whispered. No, Shefo agreed. It isn't. But fair has very little to do with men like Kong Min-ho, and even less to do with the world deciding what a woman like you is allowed to want. By noon, 3 reporters were camped outside Seoul House. By evening, a producer from a national gossip program had tracked down Mary's cousin, the only family she had in Korea, offering money for an interview about the woman who seduced a CEO. Mary's cousin refused, but the calls didn't stop, and neither did the fear settling cold and permanent in Mary's chest. She turned off her phone. She sat alone in her small apartment with the lights off, curtains drawn, and for the first time since the water had burst through that pipe weeks ago, she let herself cry, not for the scandal, not for the reporters, but for the quiet, foolish hope she let herself feel in an alley with a man who was never, ever going to be allowed to choose her. Min-ho came anyway. He came that night, past the reporters camped outside her building, through a service entrance Chef O had quietly shown him, and knocked on her door with his tie gone and his composure gone with it. You shouldn't be here, Mary said, opening the door only enough to see him. It'll only make it worse. I don't care, he said. Mary, let me in. She hesitated only a moment before stepping back, and he crossed the threshold like a man walking into the only safe room left in a burning building. I called off the engagement this afternoon, he said, before she could speak. Officially, in front of the board, Ji-Yeon's father is threatening to pull every contract his family hold with mine. My own father hasn't spoken to me since. The merger, 6,000 jobs, may not survive this. Min-ho! Her voice broke on his name. This is exactly what I was afraid of. I told you. I know what you told me, he said, closing the distance between them, cupping her face like he was afraid she might disappear if he didn't. And I would do it again. Every version of this, every consequence, I would choose it again. Because the alternative was living my whole life as a stranger myself, married to a woman I don't love, mourning a version of happiness I never let myself have. I choose you, Mary. Publicly. Completely. Whatever it costs. It could cost you everything, she whispered. Then let it, he said. I would rather have nothing with you than everything without you. She kissed him first that time, desperate and certain all at once, and he held her like the world outside her door. The reporters, the boardrooms, the fury of 2 powerful families had simply ceased to exist. But the world did not cease to exist. It only waited, patient and merciless, for the moment it would come crashing back through her door. The following week brought a fragile, dangerous kind of peace. Min-ho moved Mary quietly into a private apartment his company owned under a shell name, away from the reporters, though he could not move the scandal itself, which had metastasized into boardroom votes and shareholder panic. Kong Holdings stock dipped 4% in 3 days. 2 board members called for his resignation. His father stopped answering his calls entirely. Mary, for her part, lost her job at Seoul House, not fired outright, but encouraged by an owner terrified of the attention, to take an extended leave that both of them understood would never end. She spent her days in the borrowed apartment, aching with guilt she couldn't quite justify and couldn't quite release, watching a man she loved lose, piece by piece, the empire he'd spent his whole life building for her. You're doing this because of me, she said one evening, watching him read shareholder reports with a face carved from stone. Your father won't speak to you. The board wants you gone. I did this to you. You didn't do anything, Min-ho said, setting the reports aside, pulling her into his lap with the exhausted gentleness of a man who had nothing left except this. A photograph did this. A family that valued contracts over happiness did this. You are the only good thing that has happened to me in this entire mess. Mary, don't you dare apologize for existing. I'm scared, she admitted, voice small in a way she rarely allowed herself. Scared that eventually you'll resent what this cost you. Scared that I'll be the reason you lose everything you built. Then let me tell you what I built, he said, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. An empire that made my father proud and made me a stranger to my own life. If loving you cost me that empire, I will build something else. Something smaller, maybe, but mine. Ours. That is not a loss, Mary. That is the first choice I have ever made for myself. She believed him in that moment with her whole aching heart. She did not yet know how close they both were to losing far more than a company. Because 2 days later, Seo Ji-eun's father made a decision that would turn a business scandal into something far more dangerous. A decision born of humiliation, of a broken contract, of a family name he refused to let a dishwasher tarnish without consequence. He picked up the phone and called a man he had used before, quietly, for problems that could not be solved with lawyers. Mary didn't know about the phone call. She knew only that the following morning, Min-ho left for an emergency board meeting with a kiss and a promise to return by evening, and that evening came and went without him. She told herself business ran long. She told herself many things that night, sitting by the window of the borrowed apartment, watching headlights sweep past on the street below, waiting for a car that did not come. At Kong Holdings, the board meeting had gone worse than even Min-ho anticipated. 3 board members, led quietly by allies of Ji-eun's father, moved to force an emergency vote on his position as CEO, citing reputational risk and instability of leadership. His own father sat at the far end of the table and said nothing in his defense. Not a word, not a glance. 40 years of silence distilled into a single unbearable afternoon. "You built this company," Min-ho said to the room, voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I have run it for 6 years without a single misstep in judgment until this. I am not ashamed of loving someone the market didn't approve. If that cost me this chair, then it cost me this chair. But I will not apologize for choosing honesty over contract." The vote was postponed, not resolved, a small mercy, a temporary reprieve, and Min-ho left the building past midnight, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with hours and everything to do with watching his own father refuse to meet his eyes. He found Mary awake when he finally arrived, curled on the couch beneath a blanket, dark circles under her eyes from a different kind of exhaustion. "I thought something happened to you," she said, voice cracking with relief and worry both. "Something is happening to me," he admitted, sitting heavily beside her. "Just not the something you're imagining." He told her about the vote, about his father's silence, about a boardroom that had spent 6 years respecting him and 1 week deciding he was a liability. "Maybe I should go," Mary said quietly, staring at her hands. "Maybe if I disappeared, this would all go back to normal for you." "Don't," Min-ho said, sharper than he intended, pulling her against him like the very suggestion frightened him more than the board vote had. "Don't ever say that again. Normal was never happiness, Mary. Normal was a cage with better lighting. I would rather fight this war beside you than win a peace without you." She pressed her face into his shoulder and let herself, for one more night, believe that love might actually be enough. It almost was, for a while. The following days brought a strange, fragile rhythm. Min-ho fighting a slow war in boardrooms during the day, returning each night more tired but never less certain. Mary learning to live in the strange half-world of hiding from cameras, while falling more completely for a man who refused, at every turn, to let her go. There were good moments amid the danger. An evening he canceled 3 meetings to take her to a small noodle shop in a neighborhood no reporter would think to check. Both of them laughing over bowls of jjajangmyeon like ordinary people with ordinary lives. A Sunday morning, he woke before her just to watch the light move across her face, marveling that something so simple could feel like the greatest privilege of his life. A night she taught him to cook the jollof rice her father used to make, both of them covered in flour and pepper. Kitchen filled with a warmth neither of them had known in years. "My father used to say," Mary told him that night, stirring the pot, "that the right person makes even hard days taste sweet." I didn't understand what he meant until now. "Your father sounds like a wise man," Min-ho said, wrapping his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder. "He would have liked you," Mary said, "even though he would have been terrified of what loving you would cost me." "He wouldn't be wrong to worry," Min-ho admitted quietly. "I've cost you a job. Privacy. Peace. I intend to spend the rest of my life making up for that. If you'll let me." She turned in his arms, flower still on her cheek, and kissed him like a promise neither of them was ready to say out loud yet. But peace, however fragile, however sweet, was never meant to last in a war neither of them had chosen to start. 3 days later, Mary noticed a car parked across from the apartment building that hadn't been there the day before. She noticed it again the next morning, and the morning after that. A dark sedan with tinted windows and no license plate she could read from the window. She mentioned it to Minho that evening, trying to keep her voice light, trying not to let the cold thread of fear in her chest bleed into her words. Probably just a curious reporter, she said. But Minho's face didn't relax the way she hoped it would. Instead, something hardened behind his eyes, recognition maybe or dread. "Describe the car," he said quietly. She did. He was quiet for a long moment afterward, jaw tight, before he pulled out his phone and made a call she wasn't meant to fully understand. Something about security, about doubling the detail outside the building, about a name she almost caught before he lowered his voice further. "Minho," she said, fear finally breaking through. "What aren't you telling me?" He set the phone down and took her hands in both of his, and for the first time since the photograph had upended both their lives, she saw real fear in his eyes. Not for himself. "Ji-Yun's father doesn't lose gracefully," he said, "and he has resources beyond boardrooms. I need you to trust me, Mary. Starting tomorrow, I want you to stay inside, doors locked, until I can be certain you're safe." "You're scaring me," she whispered. "Good," he said, pressing his forehead to hers, voice rough with emotion she'd never heard from him before. "Because I'm scared too, and I would rather you be frightened and safe than calm and in danger. I will not let anything happen to you. Do you understand me? Whatever it takes, I will not let anyone take you from me." She nodded, throat too tight to speak, and let him hold her through the night, both of them pretending. For a few more hours, that love alone might be enough to keep the coming storm at bay. It was not. 2 nights later, while Minho was pulled into an unavoidable late meeting with panicked investors, the security detail outside Mary's building was called away on a false emergency 30 minutes across town, a diversion planned with precision by men who had done this kind of work before. Mary heard the knock at 11 that night and made the mistake, just once, of opening the door thinking it was a delivery she'd ordered. It was not a delivery. 2 men in dark coats forced their way inside before she could scream, one hand clamped hard over her mouth. And the last thing Mary saw before the world went dark was her phone, knocked from the counter, screen lighting up with a call from Minho that she would never get the chance to answer. Minho arrived back at the apartment just after midnight, still rehearsing the calm words he planned to say to Mary about the investor panic, and found the door standing open, the lamp knocked sideways, her phone shattered on the floor, beneath his own unanswered call. For one long, terrible moment, he could not breathe. Then instinct took over where fear tried to freeze him. He called his head of security first, then the police, then, with hands that were not quite steady, a private investigator his family had used for decades for problems too delicate for official channels. "Find her," he said, voice a low, controlled fury that frightened even the men who worked for him. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care whose name we have to drag through the mud to do it. Find her tonight." By 1 in the morning, grainy footage from a neighboring building's camera showed a dark sedan pulling away from the block at 11:04 p.m. The same car Mary had described days before, the same plate, deliberately obscured, but not perfectly. By 2, Minho's investigator had traced the vehicle to a logistics company quietly owned, 3 shell corporations deep, by a business partner of CO Ji-Yun's father. Minho did not wait for the police to move carefully through proper channels. He drove to the old man's estate himself, alone, past midnight, security detail trailing 2 cars behind, fury burning cold and absolute in his chest. He found Ji-Yun's father in his study, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, looking entirely unsurprised to see him. "You've made a very serious mistake," Minho said, closing the door behind him. "I've corrected one," the old man replied calmly. "You embarrass my daughter in front of this entire country. I am simply ensuring the girl understands the cost of humiliating families like ours." "Where is she?" It was not a question. "Somewhere safe," the old man said, swirling his brandy. "For now, whether she stays that way depends entirely on you. Minho, marry my daughter as planned. Issue a public statement calling this affair a temporary lapse in judgment. Do that, and the girl goes home unharmed quietly tonight. And if I refuse?" The old man's smile did not reach his eyes. "Then accidents happen in this city to people no one is looking for. A foreign woman with no family here, no protection, no name anyone would miss. Think carefully, Minho." This is the only mercy I intend to offer. Something in Min-ho went very quiet and very dangerous. He had spent his whole life being told what to want, what to build, what to sacrifice for his father's legacy. But nothing had prepared him for particular violence of hearing a man threaten to erase Mary from the world like she was an inconvenience to be filed away. You misunderstand something, Min-ho said, voice low. I built an empire before I turned 30. I have resources you have not begun to imagine. Connections in every ministry your daughter's contract depend on, and exactly nothing left to lose tonight. If one hair on her head is harmed, I will spend every remaining dollar of my fortune and every remaining year of my life burying your family so completely that your grandchildren will not recognize your name. Do you understand me? For the first time, something like doubt flickered across the old man's composed face. You're bluffing, he said, though less certainly than before. Test me, Min-ho said, and find out. The old man held his gaze for a long moment before something in him. Pride, calculation, the particular cowardice of men who threaten violence but flinch from consequence, cracked. She's at the old warehouse facility on the industrial docks. He said finally, unharmed. I never intended real harm, only leverage. You have my word. Your word, Min-ho said, already moving for the door, means considerably less to me tonight than it did an hour ago. He called a security detail from the car, diverting them to the docks, adrenaline the only thing keeping the terror in his chest from swallowing him whole. He called the police as well this time, giving them everything. The address, the shell company, the old man's confession, evidence enough to end more than one powerful family's protection from consequence. The drive to the industrial docks took 11 minutes that felt like 11 years. Rain had started somewhere in the last hour, streaking the windshield, blurring streetlights into long gold smears across wet asphalt, and every second felt like a second too many. Mary, meanwhile, had woken in a cold, unfamiliar room, wrists bound loosely to a metal chair, more frightened than she had ever been in her life, but refusing, with the same stubbornness that had carried her across an ocean, and through 3 years of scrubbing pots for strangers, to let that fear win. You won't get away with this, she said to the two men guarding the door, voice steadier than she felt. Not our problem. One of them said, not unkindly, checking his phone for the third time in 10 minutes. We're just paid to hold you until the boss says otherwise. Mary studied the room in the dim light. A single bare bulb, crates stacked along one wall, a door that led, she guessed, to a loading dock beyond. She thought of her father, of the courage it had taken him to keep his tailor shop running through years of hardship, of the courage it had taken her to board a plane alone at 22 with nothing but a scholarship letter and a stubborn refusal to be small. She thought of Min-ho, and a particular, fierce certainty in his eyes when he told her he would not let anyone take her from him. She believed him. She held on to that belief like a rope in the dark. It took Min-ho's security team 6 minutes to breach the warehouse's outer perimeter, working in silent coordination with the police units now converging from 2 directions. Min-ho, against every protocol his own men shouted at him, was first through the door. He found her in the third room he checked, tied but unhurt, and the sound that tore out his chest when their eyes met was not quite relief, and not quite grief, but some raw, desperate combination of both. Min-ho! Her voice broke on his name. I'm here, he said, crossing the room in 3 strides, hands shaking as he worked the bindings loose. Pulling her into his arms a moment, she was free like he needed to feel her heart beat against his own to believe she was truly safe. I'm here. I've got you. You're safe now. I promise you're safe. She sobbed into his shoulder, months of fear finally breaking loose, and he held her like the rest of the world. The police clearing the building around them, the guards being arrested, the case that would soon topple Co. Ji-yeon's father's empire of quiet threats and shell companies, had simply ceased to matter. I knew you'd come, she whispered against his chest. I knew it. I will always come, he said, pressing his lips to her hair, voice rough with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide. For the rest of my life, Mary, if you ever need me, I will always come. The story broke publicly within days. Not the scandal in the affair this time, but the far larger scandal of the powerful family's attempt to kidnap a foreign national to coerce a business merger, evidence airtight thanks to Min-ho's investigator, the shell companies, and a confession the old man had been foolish enough to make within earshot of a hidden recorder Minho security chief had insisted he carry. Co Ji-yeon's father was arrested within the week. Ji-yeon herself, humiliated and furious, released a statement distancing herself entirely from her father's actions, quietly relieved, if she was honest with herself, to be free of an engagement that had never been about love to begin with. Kong Holdings board, faced with CEO who had just survived an attempted kidnapping of the woman he loved with more composure and strategic precision than most executives managed on an ordinary Tuesday, quietly withdrew the motion to remove him. The merger, against all odds, survived, restructured, renegotiated, but intact, the 6,000 jobs Minho had fought so hard to protect preserved after all. His father came to see him 3 days after the rescue, standing awkwardly in the doorway of Minho's office, like a man who did not know how to apologize because he had never been taught. "I should have supported you," his father said finally, voice gruff with an emotion he clearly struggled to name. "Your mother would have been ashamed of my silence. I was ashamed of it myself. Watching the news, realizing what almost happened because I cared more about a merger than my own son's happiness." "You could have said something at the board meeting," Minho said, not quite ready to forgive, but no longer willing to carry the wound in silence either. "I know," his father said. "I am telling you now instead. Bring her to dinner. Minho, I would like to meet the woman who survived a kidnapping and still, apparently, makes my son smile like I have not seen him smile since he was a boy." It was not quite an apology, but it was, Minho understood, as close as his father had ever come to one, and he found himself unexpectedly moved by it. The dinner happened 2 weeks later, in his father's traditional home rather than the sterile boardroom Minho had expected, and Mary arrived nervous enough to have changed her outfit 4 times, terrified of a man whose approval, she understood, mattered more to Minho than he let himself admit. She needn't have worried. Minho's father watched her through the first course with the careful, assessing silence of a man who had built an empire on reading people. And by the second course, something in his expression had softened into something almost like respect. "You fixed the pipe," he said finally, "at the restaurant. My assistant showed me the security footage. Out of curiosity, you knew exactly where that valve was hidden. Most trained maintenance staff wouldn't have found it that quickly." "I pay attention," Mary said simply. "It's a habit from watching my father work. He always said the details other people ignore are usually the ones that matter most." "Your father sounds like he raised you well," the old man said, and something in his voice, gruff and unpracticed, carried real warmth. "I am sorry for the pain my son's world has caused you these past months. I am told you handled a kidnapping with more composure than half my board managed during a routine budget review. I find I am not surprised." Mary laughed despite herself, some of the tension in her shoulders finally easing, and across the table, Minho watched the 2 most important people in his life find their way toward each other, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that resembled peace. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Reporters who lingered a while longer, board members who took time to fully trust him again. Mary's own slow, careful process of rebuilding a sense of safety after what she'd survived. But difficulty, Minho had learned, was survivable in a way loneliness never had been. Difficulty, faced together, had a way of becoming simply life. He proposed on a night that mattered to both of them, the anniversary of the night the pipe had burst, the night everything had begun, at the same garden door where he'd first asked her to give him 5 minutes. He didn't have an elaborate speech prepared. He had, instead, the truth, spoken plainly beneath the same paper lantern that had lit their first stolen conversation. "I have built an empire," he said, kneeling in front of her, ring in hand, voice unsteady in a way his boardroom had never once heard. "I have negotiated mergers worth more money than most countries' budgets. And none of it, Mary, none of it, has ever mattered me the way 5 minutes with you by this door mattered. You washed dishes in the back of a restaurant and taught me more about courage than every mentor I've ever had. You survived the kidnapping meant to break you and came out of it more certain of who you are, not less. I don't want an empire without you in it. I want a life. Ours. Will you marry me?" Mary was crying before he finished, And her answer, when it came, was so immediate and so certain that the small crowd of restaurant staff who had quietly gathered at the windows, Chef-O included, wiping his own eyes with a dish towel, burst into applause loud enough to carry into the street. "Yes," she said, pulling him up into her arms before he could even slide the ring onto her finger properly. "Yes, Kang Min-ho. 1,000 times, yes." They married the following spring, a ceremony that blended both their worlds with a deliberateness that mattered enormously to both of them. Traditional Korean rites in the morning, honoring his mother's memory and his father's legacy, followed by an evening reception threaded through with Nigerian music and food that filled the air with the warmth of jollof rice and laughter, a tribute to the father Mary had lost too young to see this day. Min-ho's father, stand and give a toast that surprised everyone in the room with its warmth, raised his glass and said simply, "My son spent his whole life being taught to want an empire. I am grateful more than I can say that he found instead a woman who taught him what it means to want a home." A year later, Mary stood in the nursery of the home they built together overlooking the same river, where they'd once sat on cold benches confessing truths that terrified them both, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, watching Min-ho argue, with the same fierce concentration he brought to every boardroom, over which shade of yellow to paint the walls. "You do know," Mary said, laughing, "that the baby will not care what color the walls are." "I care," Min-ho said, entirely serious, holding up 2 paint swatches that looked identical to her eye. "Everything about this child's life is going to be considered, deliberate, chosen, nothing left to chance, the way nothing about us was ever supposed to happen, and it happened anyway, and it became the best thing in my life." She crossed the room and kissed him, swatches forgotten, his hand finding hers over the small, growing miracle neither of them had ever expected to be lucky enough to hold. "Welcome to Afrokorea Seoul Stories," Mary whispered against his lips, laughing at her own joke, at the strange, impossible journey that had carried a dishwasher from Lagos into the arms of a man the whole country had once called untouchable. Please like, share, and subscribe. Min-ho laughed, really laughed, the sound echoing warm through a nursery that would soon hold their child, in a home built not on strategy or empire, but on the simple, stubborn, unbreakable choice 2 people had made to choose each other, no matter what it cost. Outside, the Seoul skyline glittered on, indifferent as ever to the small, extraordinary miracles unfolding within it. But inside that house, for 2 people who had once been strangers separated by an ocean and an impossible distance and circumstance, everything that mattered had finally, fully come home. Thank you for listening and watching this story. If you enjoyed the story, please do like, share, and subscribe to this channel.